Hello, as always, here are four overlooked historical murder cases. Let's dive into the stories. 1. Walter Calverley murdered two of his young children. Walter Calverley was born in the year 1570. He was an English squire from Yorkshire, born to Sir William Calverley and Lady Catherine Thornhome. He married Philippa Brooke, the daughter of Sir Henry Brooke, fifth son of Cobham and Lady Anne. Young Walter experienced psychological trauma and exhibited violent outbursts. Due to substantial fines imposed on the family by the government, they were forced to sell off land. When Walter inherited his father's estate, he encountered financial difficulties and fell into a deep melancholy. After marrying Philippa, the daughter of the Honorable Henry Brooke, Walter was desperate for a son and heir. However, he grew increasingly moody, wandering the old hall, consumed by depression that was exacerbated by heavy drinking. He remained welcoming to friends and frequently hosted dinner parties at the hall. During one of these gatherings, a friend named Leventhorpe was introduced to Philippa. A lover of literature, he often quoted poetry, which resonated with Philippa, leading to a budding friendship between them. Leventhorpe became a regular visitor at the hall, sometimes when Walter was away. Although their relationship was platonic, Walter was filled with jealousy. When Philippa gave birth to a son, William, there was much celebration. But after the arrival of their second son, Walter became convinced he was not the father. His depression worsened, he began to drink heavily, and he grew increasingly confrontational towards Leventhorpe, who maintained that he had not been involved with Philippa. After giving birth to her third child, Henry, Philippa was left in a fragile state, so much so that the baby had to be nursed at a farmhouse 2 miles away for safety. On April 22, 1605, Walter accused his wife of infidelity, a charge she vehemently denied. His aggressive demeanor terrified her, and her desperate screams summoned the servants, who rushed in to intervene. Following a night of heavy drinking, Walter awoke late on April 23rd, his mind clouded by alcohol. He consumed more ale, spiraling deeper into madness and plotting a horrific act of violence. He called for his horse and sent his male servants on a fabricated errand, ensuring that he would be alone to carry out his sinister plan. Staggering through the hall, he stumbled upon his 4-year-old son, William, who was innocently playing. In a fit of rage, Walter seized the child and brutally stabbed him with a dagger, the child's cries echoing in the silence of the house. Consumed by a frenzy, he carried the bloodied body upstairs and threw it onto the floor of Philippa's bedroom, where she was nursing their 18-month-old son, also named Walter. As Walter lunged at the infant with his dagger, Philippa instinctively tried to protect her child. In the chaos, she was wounded, but could not save her baby from his father's wrath. Believing he had killed both of his sons, Walter fled the scene, his mind racing with thoughts of destroying their youngest child, Henry. He intended to ride to the farmhouse where the baby was being cared for and commit the same atrocity. However, in his drunken state, Walter lost control, falling off his horse as he tried to make his escape. Soon his frantic servants, who had been in pursuit, caught up with him, ready to confront the unfolding tragedy. Walter was brought to trial at York Castle. When asked to enter a plea, he stubbornly refused to declare himself guilty or not guilty. Instead, a board was placed over him, and weights were gradually added, slowly crushing his body. Despite enduring excruciating pain, he continued to refuse to plead and ultimately succumbed to his injuries. He was laid to rest at St. Mary's Church in Castlegate, York. Many believe that his ghost now haunts the old hall and its surrounding grounds, as well as the nearby Calverley Woods. 2. The disappearance of Mona Blades. Mona Blades was an 18-year-old girl living in Hamilton, New Zealand, when she decided to hitchhike to Hastings for her nephew's birthday during the Queen's birthday weekend. The journey from Hamilton to Hastings takes nearly 4 hours, a drive that would be further complicated by holiday traffic. On the morning of May 31st, her friend Tom dropped her off on State Highway 1. She was last seen around 10 a.m. in an orange Datsun. Later that morning, a fencing contractor noticed the car parked about 200 meters down a dirt road off the Napier-Topo Highway. He saw a woman resembling Mona in the back seat, with a middle-aged man in the driver's seat. When the contractor passed by again shortly after, the car was empty. Since Mona's trip was a surprise, no one realized she was missing until 3 days later when she failed to return home. She was supposed to start a new job at a dairy that day, prompting a search to be initiated. Despite numerous sightings reported from across New Zealand, efforts to locate her were unsuccessful. After 13 days of exhaustive searches using search dogs, helicopters, and heat-seeking devices, a detective on the case stated that it was unlikely she would ever be found alive. The police continued their efforts to find both a body and a potential killer. They appealed to the public for information about the car she was last seen in, which was occupied by a man described as middle-aged, large, balding, and possibly wearing glasses. Although the description was vague, 2 weeks after her disappearance, the police publicly announced their search for the orange Datsun. Authorities have identified around 5 suspects in this case. One potential suspect, John Freeman, happened to rent an orange Datsun that same weekend. On the day police announced their search for the car, he shot and wounded a student at a college in Auckland before taking his own life. While this isn't conclusive evidence of his involvement, it certainly raises eerie questions. Another suspect in the case was Mervyn Derek Hinton, a former traffic officer accused by another police officer, Tony Muller. Muller, who served as a sergeant on the Kawerau police force for a decade and was close friends with Hinton, had long suspected him in connection with the disappearance. He gathered information and shared it with the police, leading to an excavation beneath Hinton's house in 2012, 3 years after Hinton had passed away. When questioned at the time of the disappearance, Hinton had famously responded, "If you think I did it, prove it." He had owned a car similar to the orange Datsun that Mona was last seen entering. Another person of interest is Charlie Hughes, who currently lives in Australia. He strongly denies any involvement in Mona's disappearance. Hughes came under police scrutiny due to his ownership of a vehicle like the one Mona was last seen in. He has been interviewed by police multiple times and provided a DNA sample. During a 2005 interview, he reiterated his innocence and expressed a desire for closure for both Mona's family and himself, as he felt that being a longtime suspect had severely impacted his life. He has publicly shared his frustration with the ongoing suspicion, speaking to newspapers and appearing on television. There is also an unnamed potential suspect who owned an orange Datsun at the time of the disappearance. He is now believed to be elderly and residing in New Zealand. Rumors have circulated that he may have killed Mona and buried her, along with the car somewhere on the dirt road where she was last seen. Years later, a young girl recounted finding a doll with the name Mona written on it under her house, a discovery that led to her being punished after her father found it. In 2004, a glimmer of hope emerged when police discovered a shallow grave with Blade's name inscribed in a Huntley garage. The name had been etched into the concrete as a joke 6 years earlier, and the former owner of the property expressed regret to her family. This case continues to be one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in New Zealand's history. 3. Matteo Banks. Matteo Banks. Kina was an Argentinian farmer who murdered 6 family members and 2 employees in Buenos Aires, Argentina, on April 18, 1922. On the morning of April 18, 1922, Matteo Banks took a train from Azul to Paris, accompanied by Maria Josefa Gaitan, a young woman hired as a maid by his unmarried sister, Maria Ana. Maria Josefa was the eldest daughter of Juan Gaitan, one of the employees of Banks's brother, Dionisio. At 9 a.m., Banks and Maria Josefa arrived in El Trebol, where Banks met a laborer and his brother working on a fence at Los Pinos, the Banks family farm nearby. They shared mate with Banks before he visited his brothers, Miguel and Dionisio, at their homes, El Trebol and La Buena Suerte. During lunch, he attempted to poison them by adding strychnine to their puchero, but the unpleasant smell and taste led them to discard the food. Later that afternoon, realizing his poisoning plan had failed, Banks traveled by sulky to La Buena Suerte, where his brother Dionisio was with his 12-year-old daughter, Sarita. Banks shot his brother twice with a double-barreled shotgun, then assaulted Sarita with the weapon before throwing her down a well. He fired 2 more shots into the well, killing her. Shortly after, when Juan Gaitan arrived, Banks shot him as soon as he dismounted from his horse. Banks then returned 5 kilometers to El Trebol, where he encountered another rural worker named Claudia Loaiza. After persuading Loaiza that his brother Dionisio was ill and needed help, they set out for La Buena Suerte. However, partway between the 2 ranches, Banks shot Loaiza dead and concealed his body. Back at El Tribal, Banks spent the evening with his sister Maria Ana, his terminally ill brother Miguel, Miguel's wife Julia Dillon, Gaetan's young daughter, Maria Ercilia, and Dionisio's other daughters, Cecilia and Anita. Later that night, he woke his sister and convinced her to go to La Buena Suerte to check on Dionisio, then shot her in the back during the journey, leaving her lifeless body on the ground. He returned to El Tribal and killed Miguel, Julia, and 15-year-old Cecilia in quick succession. He spared 5-year-old Anita and 4-year-old Maria Ercilia, locking them in a room after giving them water and hardtack. In the early hours of April 19, Banks sought help from the family doctor, Rafael Marcostan, who lived nearby. He claimed that his entire family had been murdered during a robbery attempt by Loaza and Gayton, asserting he had shot them in self-defense. He asked Marcostan for a ride to Azul. While en route in the doctor's car, still carrying the shotgun, Banks suspiciously suggested that no autopsies were necessary. Upon arriving at his house in Azul, he ordered 7 coffins from the local mortuary, fully aware that Loaza's body was still missing. He then attempted to contact his friend Agustin Carus, a well-known lawyer, but Carus ultimately refused to help him. During the investigation, it was uncovered that Banks had squandered his fortune through gambling and was nearing financial ruin. Even after selling part of his inheritance to his siblings, he had also sold large quantities of cattle that did not belong to him by forging his brother Dionisio's signature. The prosecutor determined that Banks aimed to hide his previous wrongdoings from his family while seeking to inherit the wealth of both Maria and Miguel. He could not claim Dionisio's fortune as long as Dionisio's wife was alive, residing in a mental institution in La Plata. This, along with her youth making her an unreliable witness, explains why he spared Anita's life. Additionally, Banks let Maria Ercilia live because her death would have contradicted his narrative that her father, Juan Gaytan, was one of the attackers. Despite being eventually sentenced to life in prison and jailed in Ushuaia's penal colony in 1924, he was released for good behavior in 1942. Rejected by his wife and sons when he tried to settle in the city of Olivaria, where they were living by then, Banks moved to Buenos Aires under the assumed name of Eduardo Morgan, presumably with the financial help of his eldest son, Francisco. Mateo Banks died there in 1949 from a fall in the bathroom of his apartment at the neighborhood of Flores, at the age of 76. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave at La Chacarita Cemetery. 4. John McCaffrey murdered his wife, Bridget McCaffrey. John McCaffrey. John McCaffrey was an Irish-American farmer born in 1820. He was the last person executed in the state of Wisconsin. The Irish man and his wife have been married for about 1 or 2 years. His wife, Bridget, is well respected in their neighborhood and is known for her kindness and integrity. However, she was completely blinded by love and did not see the signs of her husband's infidelity. Recent revelations suggest that John McCaffrey has been spending time with other women, which has left Bridget feeling shocked and betrayed. Just before midnight on July 22, 1850, John returned home and Bridget, sensing something was amiss, decided to confront him about his whereabouts. She looked into his eyes, seeking the truth, and her heart raced as she prepared to ask the questions that weighed heavily on her mind. McCaffrey's neighbors were alarmed when they heard his wife, Bridget, screaming in distress, shouting phrases like, "Oh, John, spare me!" and "Oh, John, save me!" The frantic cries pierced the quiet of the neighborhood, prompting several neighbors to rush over to investigate the commotion. As they approached the McCaffrey home, they spotted John emerging, drenched and muddy, looking disheveled and agitated. When the neighbors inquired about what had happened and asked about Bridget's whereabouts, John responded curtly, "She is bad enough," his tone lacking the urgency one might expect in such a dire situation. This vague answer only heightened their concern, prompting them to search the property for Bridget. Their investigation led them to a disturbing discovery. Bridget McCaffrey's lifeless body was submerged in 15 to 20 inches of water within a hogshead that had been buried in the ground, serving as a makeshift cistern. The water was still warm, indicating that her death had occurred recently. A doctor was summoned to the scene, and after assessing the situation, he pronounced her dead from drowning, leaving the neighbors in shock and disbelief over the tragic turn of events. At the trial of John McCaffrey on May 23, 1851, after careful deliberation, The jury returned with a verdict that resounded throughout the room. Guilty of willful murder. Judge E.V. Whitten addressed the court with a solemn tone, calling everyone to attention. "Listen now to the sentence of the court," he declared. "The sentence of the court is that you, John McCaffrey, be confined as a close prisoner in the common jail of this county until the time appointed by the governor of this state by his warrant for your execution. And at that time you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." As the date of the execution approached, anticipation and anxiety grew among the townspeople. On the day of the execution, between 2,000 and 3,000 people gathered just south of the city of Kenosha, drawn by morbid curiosity and the desire to witness the grim event. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of fear, excitement, and a sense of justice. When the moment arrived, McCaffrey stood before the assembled crowd, a figure shrouded in the weight of his impending fate. Before a white hood was placed over his head, he spoke in a low, trembling voice. "I was the cause of the death of my wife, and I hope my fate will be a warning to you all. I forgive all my enemies. I forgive all the witnesses against me." His words, though sorrowful, echoed with a chilling acceptance of his destiny. A few moments later, the sheriff approached McCaffrey, placing the noose around his neck with a practiced hand. With a swift movement, he stepped on the spring mechanism that hoisted McCaffrey into the air. The crowd watched in hushed silence as he struggled against the rope, his body twisting and thrashing for 5 agonizing minutes. After 8 minutes had passed, a team of doctors began to check his pulse, noting that it had slowed significantly. They continued to monitor him closely, periodically checking for signs of life over the next 10 minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, McCaffrey was declared dead.